This week it's all about grazing cover crops, so naturally Kevin's here in the studio.
Well, thank you, Abby, and it's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Kevin Sedivec. I'm the NDSU Extension Rangeland Management Specialist and the Director for Central Grasslands Research Extension Center located near Streator.
We have a great panel lined up for today, so let's meet everyone and get into our conversations. So let's start with Doug. Doug out in Dickinson. Can you introduce yourself?
I'm a beef cattle specialist at Dickinson and work with integrated systems with both cropping and kind of a very large project out here looking at crop production, beef production, and the integrated effects on soil health. And we're also finishing some cattle coming out of that system. So it's got a lot of departments in it, and we're learning a lot of things. So it's kind of fun and interesting to do that.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, Doug. And we also have Ashley from out in Golden Valley. If you can introduce yourself.
My name is Shelly Ueckert. I'm out in Beach, North Dakota. I'm the extension agent out here. I work with NDSU Extension. And I guess I've been helping Doug on an alternative forage trial where we've been looking at some cover crops and using those for forage, as well as some grazings.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us. And we have Dan from down in Gettysburg, South Dakota. Hey, Dan.
Yeah, Dan Forgey, Gettysburg, South Dakota. Longtime no-tiller, believe in soil health, and I really believe that grazing cattle on the farm is very important. So a lot of different ways to do it out there, and always trying to learn. So I'm going to learn here just as much as I'm going to share. But going to be a great conversation.
Well, thanks for joining us, Dan. And then, of course, Kevin, you're also on the panel. So you'll get to guide the conversation, but I'm also going to ask a lot of questions to you, too. So maybe let's start off with Kevin. And you know, you can have a simple or pretty complex system when it comes to grazing cover crops. And so what are some of the options or your basic guidelines for just creating a system where you're grazing?
You know, that's a great question. And we just had this question asked last week at a different meeting. And producers asked, how should we incorporate grazing into our cover crops? And you want to start small. You don't want to think big scale when you start grazing, because you don't know if you have the infrastructure in place to handle a grazing operation. So what do you have for fencing? What do you have for water? What do you have for labor? And so when you look at these questions on where you should go to look at grazing in a cover crop system, one, I think the beauty of grazing, it adds a biology. It adds another component that creates biology to the soil. And so, but as a producer, you don't want to come in there and cover 2,000 acres. You're probably going to look at starting small at a 60 or 80 acre piece that you can put in some fence and some water to start at that scale and see how it works for you, and then grow with your system to get more benefits across your land.
Awesome. Well, that's good. I think we need a point to kind of get started with this so that we don't get in over our heads with grazing, right, especially if you don't have livestock already. So thanks for that. You
bet. So let's find out from Dan, what are some of your experiences with grazing cover crops? What's worked, what hasn't worked, and give us some good tools that you have in your back pocket.
You know, Kevin, I appreciate your comments, but one thing that really stands out to me is that you don't try to overdo your cover crop mix. I'm not saying that I like diversity. I like to keep it to about 8. But one thing I found out too is that it's tremendously important to leave some of your residue. We will, on our goal on our farm is to leave a 30% of our residue after we get done grazing. So there you go into your fences and paddocks, and we really believe in paddocks, but we've also ran into some trouble with kind of a too high brassica low carbon mix. So we're still learning, but I really believe that this is a tool that'll increase the soil health on your farm.
Yeah, so you probably got some experience with that, Kevin, on the carbon and nitrogen ratios, and where do you fall within that mix for soil health?
You know, I think Dan makes a great point that when you look at your mixes, and whether you go with a 5-way mix, a 10-way mix, a 20-way mix, you want to make sure you have a good balance of fiber and nutrition or quality, which you see with the brassicas. And if we get too high in brassicas, of course, we have issues with too much water in the system, and then the cattle can't handle that very well. So Dan makes a great point of having a nice mix of quality as well as fiber in that mix to keep those animals' rumen functioning properly.
Doug, you've got some experience out there in western North Dakota, especially from your cover crop forage demonstration. And what have you found to work best in drier conditions out there?
Well, I think regardless of where you're located, this comment that Dan makes, as well as Kevin, about the ratio, carbon nitrogen ratio and the ratio of crops and brassicas is right on. I don't think it matters where you're at, because we're talking at that point, we are talking about the rumen of the animal, and we have to have that. We have to have those crops that will really feed this animal. And I've noticed some other questions about gain relative to animals grazing cover crops, and we've been doing this here for about 10 years. And I have seen a tremendous amount of variability, especially in average daily gains, going back to that cropping situation where you maybe have too many high quality forages, but that ratio is not there. And one particular situation I can think of is when we had, in 2017, it was a very bad drought for us. And because of that drought, these crops did not germinate until the first week, I think, of August, when we finally got some rain. Well, then they grew, but they don't grow very fast at that time. When they did grow, then to add insult to injury, we had early frost, and so then that frost impacted the crop. And basically, when we started grazing that, we didn't get a lot of grazing, but when we did graze, those animals actually lost 2 3/4 pounds a day. So this points and gets right back to this issue of too much water and not enough fiber in that diet so that those cattle could gain. And so we saw a real nice wreck. It wasn't a long period, because the subsequent crop brought the cattle back up to over 3 pounds a day. So to address that situation, we see that. I don't think it matters whether it's a dry area or wet area. The principle is still the same with respect to ruminant animals.
I think Doug makes a great point, and we saw the same issues in 2020. When we had tested 6 different producers or 6 different locations on cover crops, and that September 7 freeze that we had really impacted those producers that didn't have enough brassicas in their mix. They were high in fiber producing warm seasons, and then they were grazing cows with calves on their side, and we saw some cow performance go down dramatically because of the lack of brassicas in that mix. So, and it was kind of a mistake. They meant to put brassicas in the mix. They just didn't know that if you seed 1.5 inch depth, you don't get brassicas. So they seeded a little bit too deep this 2020, and they lost those brassicas. But it's important to understand that environment will drive how you should manage those livestock on those resources. And I want to follow up with Ashley here. So Ashley, you've been working with cover crops for haying out of Golden Valley for a number of years now. What are you finding as good options for cover crops in a haying system?
We've been doing this for about 2 years out here on this particular trial, and we tried it several years ago without much success, and this one has been much more successful. And just looking at season long and forage and haying. But I think what we're finding is that no matter what it is that your goal is, we can find a mix that will work for you. But in the 2 years that we've done it, we had very different weather years. We had 2019 that was almost on the verge of being too wet, if there is such a thing, and 2020 where we were pretty dry. And the difference in the tonnage was, on some of those higher yieldings in 2019, we were getting almost 8 ton to the acre with some sorghum sedans and things like that in our mixes. But some of our relative feed values and things just weren't there because of the amount of stock and those things that we had. So I think what we're finding is that you need to be somewhat cognizant of what you think your weather pattern will be throughout your growing season, and what it is that your goals are, because even something as simple as some of these oat, 2 and 3 species mixes can be a really good option if what you're looking for is just a high quality supplemental type forage. But if you're looking for tonnage because we're in a drought situation and you need some bulk to get into those cows, that's when some of these other mixes are actually looking like they might be these more species, the sorghum sedan, some of those are looking like they could be really important for us on the forage side, because some of those species will dig a little deeper, find that moisture, and those tended to do a little better for us this last year than those other ones, and it may be worth the risk in losing some of that feed value.
So now, Kevin, I know you've worked with winter annuals, and is there a place in this full season grazing system for a winter annual to help kind of buffer some of that risk that you have of early frost or things like that?
I do think the winter cereals play an important role in cover crops. For one, they provide cover in the soil, this protective armor we talk about in that fall and early spring period. And so the winter cereals can follow a crop, they can follow a cover crop in particular as well, that has value for those time periods when we would typically have bare soil. The value of the winter cereals can be either used for a hay crop or they can be used for grazing. In 2020, we actually looked at different winter cereals and the value of those winter cereals for grazing heifers. And so we tested the winter rye, which is the more common winter cereal used today in a cropping system. We also tested winter treated kale. And then I wanted to test the Willow Creek winter wheat, which to me has a tremendous value as a hay type of situation. One thing we found was Willow Creek is too slow growing. Doesn't have the same growth patterns as winter rye or winter treated kale. But we got a tremendous benefit from that early spring grazing, that month of May when we were able to take cattle off the feeding systems and put them back into a grazing scenario. So we got this benefit of a grazable feed. We got the benefit of the soil health characteristics, and it extended our native range longer into the season when we could turn those out. What was interesting was our heifers on winter rye gained almost a pound a day gain on that operation, and we produced almost 2 tons of hay per acre by June 5th. So it was a great opportunity to provide another avenue for hitting those windows when we don't have a lot of growth in that fall and spring period.
So Dan, are you using, some of the winter annuals in your full season mixes, or what's kind of your go-to? What's your favorite that you're grazing down there?
Abbey, that's the first thing a guy needs to do is decide on what direction you're going to go. We do both. We're big wheat farmers, so after a winter wheat crop, we will come in with the cover crop if we have adequate moisture. But the full season cover is what I like to do is the first week in July. And the reason to do that is just to get growth on your long season. And on that, we were talking about carbon to nitrogen ratio. And a lot of times what I try to do is I try to hit like a 29 to 30 carbon to nitrogen ratio. And then usually I don't obtain that, and then let it go and then plan on grazing that in December. But a lot of times the one crops I like is like some of the sorghum sedan, the BMR corns, the oats, the barley, the flax, and then I'll put in some forage peas or something, stay fairly light on the legumes. So them are just some of the mixes. Then you get later in the fall where you don't get a lot of time for growth, especially with the late harvest or with not adequate moisture. So a lot of times I'll do oats, barley, and then I love flax. Flax is very mycorrhizal, just like with the oats. And one thing we kind of worked with some this year is we planted some 60-inch corn and we had covers in between, and I put some cereal rye in the summertime. And I think that's something that guys should probably look at, especially if you're under a pivot, because I think it can really increase your grazing days, but because it doesn't do anything, it won't vernalize. So all it does is kind of sprawl out. But I was impressed with the root structure, even this as dry as you were this summer with that cereal rye in our cover. Just didn't quite have enough in our cover crop mix on that, but that's something I think a guy should try.
I think Dan makes a great point on looking at species mixes based on environmental conditions. And I think it comes down to you got to be flexible on these mixes. A lot of times we talk to producers and they have a mix in mind, they want to put that mix in. But if it's a dry year, you need to modify them to fit the environment. There's certain species that do better in drier years, like a barley or even a sedan grass that you can put in there, or a millet, that because it's dry, you don't have to put all the costs into all these species that are going to fail anyway. So look at the environment you have, and you're going to pick and choose some of them species to fit that environment.
We have a question on here about should seed mixes be changed based on grazing system used? And I'm not sure, does grazing system mean the time you have the cows on there, or what might that, maybe we can get a little clarification on that, but maybe there's something you can intuitively pull from that.
Sure, and I'll ask Doug to jump in here too, but for me, I always base my mixes for cover crops based on my goals of the soil. And so I'm trying to create an environment that enhances soil health. And then I can pick and choose on those species that also have great forage value for a grazing animal. And so that's what I look at, soil health first, then I pick my species that fit the situation. When it comes to grazing season, it's probably more a function of grazing season. Do you want a full season versus a fall? And a lot of that will really come down to available soil moisture, environmental conditions will drive some of those selections. And all of ours, like Dan talks about his in terms of rotating among his pastures, we strip graze ours to get the most efficiency out of the input or intake by those livestock. And I don't know, Doug, do you have any field feed on them as well? Being you're obviously in a much drier climate as well as Ashley. So is Dan, I guess.
I agree with Kevin, and as we have put these cover crops together, I guess the primary focus on the cover crop when we began this whole down this road many years ago was to enhance soil health, to control erosion, whether it was wind or water and what have you. And so the cover crop that we've used and I try to use is something in that 35 to 45 CN ratio. And now, contrary to what Dan said about the number of legumes, in our situation, we're looking at this cover crop as a potential to help enhance soil nitrogen mineralization for the subsequent crop that we're going to raise. In our rotation, it happens to be corn. And so in that process, we want to see enough legumes, and we get those from pea, from other legumes that are in the mix. And so our mix has about 60% legume. And then the balance is made up of other crops that will give us more fiber. But in the process of doing that, we find that we're able to increase the amount of mineralized nitrogen. And so with our soil analysis with Larry Chachik and the Soil Science Department, we've determined with those mineralization studies that if I could put this in a number, that we're producing about 16.8 pounds of mineralizable N for each 1% increase in soil organic matter. So our goal, of course, is to increase soil organic matter. But as this crop, from season to season, we generate soil organic matter, soil microorganisms process it and make it available for plant growth. And so we have this manufacturing process going on in the soil with the microbes and the plants consuming it. So we have this cycling going on in the soil. And one of our goals, of course, is to increase soil organic matter, but at the same time, we're also using it for feed and plant food for the plant. So it's kind of a challenge, but it works. And so getting back to Kevin's thing, we focus on soil health first, and then whatever above ground biomass we might get for livestock production comes second.
Well, thanks, Doug. I mean, I see they're expanding on the question on grazing systems and how our cattle moved, an example of mob grazing or swath grazing, and so for us, when we look at strip grazing, we were kind of doing a mini version of a mob grazing. We're trying to increase our stock density as we move through to get a more efficient uptake of the forages. Then we move them across that field to increase efficiency. Mob grazing is a technique that really gets into high stock densities. The negative to mob grazing is it can create a lot of intake. Normally mob grazing is designed to create more trampling, but if you have a really high quality feed, you'll see more intake. And then the question comes, are you leaving enough residue behind to help those soil microbes as it breaks down? In terms of swath grazing, there's a question on swath grazing of pros and cons. And I'm a huge advocate of swath grazing. I think it's a technique we can use to capture the quality of that feed at a specific vegetative state. We can lay it up in a swath, and it retains in that high quality for that whole time period, and it gives you flexibility of grazing that any time into the fall or even winter periods because you've harvested it at a high quality feed base. And so it's a great way to reduce your costs of baling, for example, and it gives you an opportunity to still spread the manure and urine on that field in a swath grazing scenario.
So all those other things, you're laying it down and leaving the field, but some things you're going to hay it and then you're going to roll it up, right? I'm not a cow person, so I'm doing my best. But if you're going to hay it, maybe Ashley, do you have some idea on things that you would want to include and things that you definitely don't want to include if you're going to roll it up into a bale that just don't do well?
from experience, as far as I like to include, for those ones that we are going to hay, I like to include a few brassicas in there, particularly some turnip and radish, so we do have something to leave in the soil, especially if we're not going to graze those. And then as far as for like rolling up in a bale, we've had pretty good luck with everything that we've tried. The ones that we have more issue with as far as drying down and getting that hay put up in a good manner is some of the grazing corns, the sunflowers, those just sorghum sedans, if they get a little, if they start to get a little bit mature on us, they get a little too much stem, they get just a little harder to dry down, and it gets harder to get a good quality forage in the bale once we get that going. So, but as long as they are cut, like the sorghum sedan, as long as it's cut before it gets too stemmy, that's been okay. And really, we've had okay luck with everything. Just expect more dry time, especially if you have some of those woodier type species in your mix.
Yeah, I think it's important when you talk about some of these high producing forages that are in a cover crop mix, is you probably need the equipment in place so you can lay them down, or you have a way to whether you have a hay bind or some way to crimp that hay so it does dry better, so you can put up a high quality feed. The big negative we hear on putting up cover crops for hay is you're taking that carbon and removing it from the system. And so one thing you can look at as a way to actually keep it in the system is then bale graze on that cover crop field. So you put them up as a bale and look at the opportunities to bale graze it to keep those carbon still on that field, as well as the added manure and urine you add to the system, is one way that you can look at the carbon, maintaining the carbon on that field. Doesn't work for everybody, and there are producers who definitely take that hay home. I think it's important to rotate those fields so you're not always mining the carbon from the field, and so you're doing it in a rotation system.
The one thing about the grazing of the hay, and these are our bulls in the background of this picture. And on the cover crop Sarah book, the cover crop profitability 3rd edition, they said that if you have a sedan grass and if you cut it, it immediately, when it's cut, if you cut it 6 to 8 inches tall, it immediately goes down. The roots will go down immediately, and then it'll start tillering. So even on a drier year, people say, well, why did that come back? It's so dry. It's going after moisture where it hasn't been before. But another thing is when you talk about something like that being what I usually do is I'll do a Piper sedan, a really fine sedan grass, and then I'll do a pearl millet, and then I'll do a forage sorghum, a BMR forage sorghum, and I like them mixes. And then I plant it a little bit thicker than what we usually do, but we've had tremendous luck doing that. And we very seldom, we don't have a growth coming back. Something you might have to watch for a little bit is the prussic acid, and that's why we usually don't graze until after a really hard frost or during, like getting back. That's how we wintered our bulls here 2 years ago on that. But I really like that program. But and one thing too that you were talking about putting some brassicas or something in that mix, and that's really easy to do at the time you're planting, because even when you cut, if you cut that like I like kale, I like Ethiopian cabbage, if you cut them off, they still come back. So anyway, I just and that's my thoughts on that hay, and one way you can do it, still keep but you stop and think about it, you're harvesting carbon, like you plant that the 4th week in May, and so like the 10th of June, you're harvesting carbon all the way up until you cut it, then it starts coming back. So you're actually harvesting carbon for a long time during the season by doing that.
Dan did mention prussic acid toxicity, and so one of the questions we have on the board, are there any species we need to watch out for in regards to toxicity, especially during drought seasons? And I'll say a couple of words here and let the Western speakers come in here as well. We do know that prussic acid toxicity can be an issue with the sedan grasses, the sorghum sedans. It comes down to importance of having them tall enough. Usually it's about 2 feet to where you're safe. Or if you have a freeze afterwards, to wait that 2 weeks for that prussic acid to volatilize out. Other ones to think about are nitrate toxicity, which you're probably going to look at more of the oats. And we do see some nitrogen toxicity with some of our brassicas, and particularly our turnips. And so those are just some issues you need to think about. And it comes down to a timing. If you do have a drought or we do have a freeze, then you get an elevated level of toxicity levels. And so you need to wait about 2 weeks before you go in and graze those, just to be safe. And our Westerners, if you had any experience with any toxicities during these dry conditions?
I guess I've had some producers that I work with that probably in the 2017 drought dealt with this a little bit more than what we did with some grazing. And we tested quite a few samples and set some samples in, and most of them, but they were fairly diverse mixes. They probably were 5 to 7 species mixes. And most of those tests did come back where they were within the safe levels, and they were able to go ahead and turn out and graze on those. And for the most part, had very good luck. Although I will say that there, a couple of them did come back and say, well, we lost one. And they could see where they had been kind of camped out in a patch that was primarily oats or primarily a millet species. So particularly with the nitrate, for the most part, there wasn't a lot of problems, but there is a little bit of risk associated there, typically with an animal that camped out on one of the more likely to accumulate nitrate species.
Okay, we've got another question here that I think, let's see, Kevin, you were talking about bale grazing. And when bale grazing, does the concentrated manure area around the bale cause problems?
It's a good question. And when it comes to bale grazing, you do get a concentration of manure and urine around those bales. For me, I look at that as a positive. I get a positive influx of nutrients from the animal, and that occurs. The negative may come back the following year if you have a lot of buildup of not only manure but also material that was in the bale. We tend to see some weedy species come in those areas, and so that may be something you have to look at is if you do get more weeds that may occur. It usually comes down to a function of leaving too much residue, but residue is good. Residue is good for soil health, and so there's a fine line of having enough residue and manure to add that benefit into the soil component. So normally I don't see an issue. You might see an issue of high nitrates if you plant a crop like an oats in those areas where you might get some buildup of nitrates in those crops.
And is that something, Doug, that maybe you've looked at out in your plots or anything with the distribution of nutrients from grazing?
I think the same thing that Kevin just said is we would see that as well. Something that I might add into Kevin's comments are if you happen to be using some bale grazing on cropland, and that's done. I mean, producers do that. When we get this buildup, they have a tremendous difficulty getting their drills to see through that thick mat of residue. And so some are actually spreading that, getting it spread out so that there isn't that much that is going to create a problem when they come in with their drills to seed the next crop. So that's one of the things that I see is the need to spread that material out if it's been done on cropland. I might make a comment also on the prussic acid, nitrates, etc. One of the things that we see sometimes these crops are, of course, are put up in silage, and prussic acid, as Kevin mentioned, is a gas, and when the cells are ruptured, that gas is released into the environment. But in the case of nitrates, they don't disappear. And one of the ways to reduce the amount of nitrate problems in a forage is to make silage. But even with the silage process, that's not 100%. And so we see that the amount of nitrates in the ensiling process from acetic acid to prussic acid at the end point of the silage process, that the nitrates are reduced maybe about 30%. So we still have to be concerned about nitrates, not as much. We have to be cognizant of blending those feeds with other feeds that are lower or have very low nitrate values so that we don't run into a problem using that. But some individuals get the idea that by using silage that its nitrates are reduced by 100%, and that's not the case, only by about 30%.
I think it's important that if people have any questions or if they feel that nitrates can be a problem, that they have those samples tested, sent to a reliable lab, and find out what your levels are. It's much easier to blend off a hot feed, a high nitrate feed, than it is to feed it whole and take a risk. So it's important to spend the $15 and see what you have in your feeds.
So now here's a question about stocking rate. So what stocking rate can we expect or plan for when grazing cover crops? The amount of expected feed per acre. And this sounds like a good question for Miranda Meehan, who I know is in the chat, and maybe she can provide some input there too. But maybe let's go to Dan and see kind of, what are you getting down there, and what do you expect?
Abbey, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to bring that up, because I think that's really important, because especially in a full season, I feel like you really have to know what you have. And so what we did, we had a really good study on a quarter section, and Jason Miller from the NRCS and Pierre really helped me through this. And so it's a scientific, there was a lot of stuff put into this, but so what we did is we wanted to find out how much we could grow. And so we put 30 pounds of nitrogen on. We soil sampled, and we only had about 20 pounds. So we put another 30 pounds on, and we increased our biomass by 35% by doing that. Not only that, we increased the feed quality. So what I really recommend you do is you go through and do a biomass, send a biomass sample in, and then find out what you have, find out how many cattle you want to graze. And then what we did was we tracked the weather through the Mesnet weather station. And so we looked out at the forecast ahead. And so we had it planned to where every 7 days we were going to move to a new paddock with there were 700 cows here on this quarter section. If it stayed warmer, we knew how much biomass we had. We knew how much the intake of the cattle were. Not only that, but visually. But I think there's a lot of things that we can put numbers to this to make this a lot more affordable in the way we're going forward. So basically what we did that year is even when with fairly heavy snow, that we took our cattle costs with the land rent, the grazing, the everything, the cover crops, the putting the fence out, everything, we took it down to 75 cents a day by doing this. And one thing I'd also like to talk on this just a minute is I really think that Toby Stoth from Dickinson State said, when I was up there, I don't know, it's probably been 8-9 years ago. And what he says, when cattle eat it, they don't really remove it, they just recycle it. So on any residue that they do eat, they retain 20% and they give back 80%. So you think about how fast you want everything to cycle for the next year, and you look at that, and so they're giving it back to your manure and urine, which will be available for the next crop year. So
that's important to understand, that people don't think about that. You're consuming that forage base, but the 80% of it goes back into the system to help either the microbial populations, fertility. It's a great way to recycle those residues that take years to break down that a cow can do in literally days. But to help answer that question, it's so variable in the environment on what your stocking rate is. And if Miranda was here, she'd tell you, Dr. Meehan was here, she'd tell you need to go out there and do some clipping and figure out what your biomass is, so you know how much you have and how long you can raise those cattle. And it comes down to what your objective is. Do you want to leave residue at 50%, 25%? You really can't judge that till you know how much biomass you have. And so we tell producers, figure some way to figure out what you have out there for biomass, so you can figure out your carrying capacities.
Nice. It looks like Miranda put something in the chat too, a link to a publication. So thanks, Miranda, for putting that in there. And I know that in talking with her that she's trained county agents across North Dakota on this technique and how to help farmers with this. So if you have any questions on it, to certainly call your extension office there and get some help on that. So, but we'll have Miranda on. She's co-hosting, I think, the last Soil Talk Tuesday. So if you have some of those questions, you can certainly follow up at that point too. But we do have another question here on, how can adding manure to our system help improve soil health? And I wonder who wants this question. Should we start with you, Kevin, and then you can pass it off to somebody else?
It's a great question in terms of what we add for it within the system, adding soil biology. And the manure itself, breaks down in time, and it adds nitrogen to the system, P and K to the system, that feeds those microbial populations, which you need to help break down. They break down and create nitrogen that's available for those plants. So it's a cycle that manure begins and ends with the actual intake by the microbes that also create that output. So that's, to me, gets to that biology. It's really adding biology to the system and adding fertility. And I think Dan and Doug and Ashley can also answer this question well on how they see the benefits of manure in a system.
Yeah, should we start with Ashley on that one? We haven't heard from you in a little bit.
I guess I will just kind of echo what Kevin says. I think we just see it as a very efficient way to spread some nutrients out there in those fields and to kind of help get that soil biology active and moving and working together. It just provides so many things that are in a natural way that are easy to get out, that's a different way to get it out there that's not mechanical. So I think that's just kind of one of the ways that we look at it as a benefit.
One of the thoughts that I've had, and it goes back to Kevin, and he visited a little bit earlier about strip grazing as a way to talk about mob grazing, and then Dan mentioned it earlier too. And I think we get back to when we talk about manure and manure distribution, the more animals we can have, regardless of the size of your grazing activity. I've been on farms where they had from 1,000 to 1,500 animals that were rotating through pastures and grazing. Been on other farms where they were just a small offering of animals. But the key, I think, is to have your pasture size set up to handle these animals in a way that they need to move more rapidly. And when you do that, we get, when you have high animal density, then the animal either drops its head and eats or it's not going to get to eat. Obviously, they eat. And so, but then we get this distribution of manure across the landscape such, and then combine that with the hoof action that's pressing that manure into the soils, and then they move. And so I think it's a kind of going back to, again, Dan's comments, when we can get that set of animals first supplying the manure and then processing the manure with their hoof action in a way, or beginning that process where we get kind of like seed to soil contact. We have to have that for germination. And we need to get that manure to soil contact to begin that microbial process. It begins to break down manures, and then that breakdown of those manures then begin to contribute to soil organic matter that Kevin talked about a little bit earlier. So concentrating the animals in such a way that you can move them and also spread manure evenly across the landscape, I think is really important.
Let's go around and if there's something that we didn't ask or that you wanted to make sure you mentioned, let's go around and do that. Since we just talked to Doug, let's go to Ashley first. Ashley, is there anything that we missed that you want to talk about or mention?
I think that haying with cover crops is something we talk about a whole lot. We talk about grazing more, and as much as I love grazing them, for some people that either don't have livestock or don't have fencing or water, it's another way to utilize a cover crop and to do some things with soil health that way. So I just wanted to again say thank you for allowing me to be part of this. And then if anybody wants to see the information that Doug and I have collected off of these plots, you can get a hold of me. I can put my email in the chat here, and we can send that information out. We just got the data from this year's plots back last week, so we're still doing a little analysis and ranking on those. But then we could share that 2 years worth of data, and it's very different looking at it from a wetter year to a drier year, and a little bit different soil conditions. And first year was very small plots, about 2 acres total. This last year we did some more field scale size plots, and so just some of the different data that we're looking at is kind of interesting as far as forage quality on these. So I'd be happy to share that if anybody's looking for that.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley. I appreciate that. And let's go to Doug and see if there's anything that we missed that you want to add.
Well, this would be an area that's actually totally different. And I saw some questions earlier about, and we talked a little bit about grazing residues from cropping. And I think it's important to make a note that when we did some work to compare just wintering cattle with hay or grazing stockpiled forages or grazing crop residues, and we found that when we grazed, compared to just hay, when we grazed a stockpiled forage along with crop residues, we were able to reduce that cost of wintering down from about roughly roughly, well, we're able to reduce it by about 80%, which I think is significant, from about $200 to winter a cow down to about, I've forgotten now what the exact number is. But anyway, we reduced it by 80%. So that is a significant issue when it comes to reducing the cost of wintering cows.
Thanks, Doug. And Dan, any final thoughts from you on grazing cover crops?
Yeah, one thing I'd like to echo is what Kevin said to start with. What you're going to do, start small. You're not going to change things dramatically in 1 year. So don't make a big mistake. Make a little mistake.
Thanks, Dan. And how about you, Kevin? What did we miss? What do we need to cover still? What are the final things that you want to wrap up?
Well, I think our panel made some good points, and I'm not going to say a whole lot more because we have another speaker coming up yet. But I do appreciate the opportunity to be here today and lead this panel discussion. I think there's some really good experiences going out in the country around the Northern Plains in particular, and I think the opportunity to add biology to the soil through a grazing or a livestock cropping interaction or systems is a great way to take a cover crop that adds soil health and also add a feed value to the livestock industry. So.
Awesome. Well, I always learn something at these grazing panels because, as most people know, I don't know a whole lot about cows. so this is something I learned a great deal from. And so thank you to all our panel members for sharing your experience. And it was definitely a great discussion. But over the next 10 minutes, we're going to catch up with Dr. Shelly Lentz and Dr. Farron Dometz. And hopefully I said that right, Farron. I apologize if I didn't. With Sustainable Vets International on some work they're doing in Nicaragua. And this is really, I was excited to hear about this project. Let's do some quick introductions. And Shelly, if you can introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Dr. Shelly. I'm out here in Killdeer, Dickinson area. Hi, Doug. I'll be talking to you soon, and Ashley. So I am the opposite of Abbey. I am a veterinarian, and I know about animals, but not much about plants. I work internationally as a veterinarian, and like a Vets Without Borders. And what I found after a decade of work, one very, very poignant experience about a little boy that had a broken leg while I was working on a broken leg of a dog was that I was taking better care of the animals than the humans were. And so I realized that in order to reduce animal suffering, you have to reduce human suffering. That seems really obvious probably to maybe other people, but to a veterinarian, it wasn't. And that's when I developed my nonprofit, which is Sustainable Vets International, that works obviously internationally with my largest project in Nicaragua. And it's basically on what causes or what are the things that help create or reduce human suffering. And basically, food security. Everybody needs a safe place to put their head and something to eat, and nutrition. And so I do children nutrition programs, pregnant women nutrition. And then the next thing is, in a lot of the countries I work in, and I was raised by a father that grew up in the war, everything can be taken away from you except for what's in your head and what your hands can do. So we really focus on vocational trades and education because everything else can be taken away, especially in countries where we don't have property rights. Lastly, I can train the best veterinarian or the best farrier or the best farmer. Unless they know how to learn to earn money, they're not going to live in that community. And so business is the other thing. And so that is the three arms of Sustainable Vets International, which became my platform of homegrown prosperity, and it's basically economic populism. And one of my mentees, students that's been working with me, but he's now a full board member of SCI, is Dr. Farron Dometz.
Thank you guys for having me. I know I'm just listening to part of the talk here, learning a little bit about cover crops and grazing cattle. I really appreciate the opportunity to share what we're doing down here. I've been working with Sustainable Vets International now almost about 8 years now. And, we've been doing some interesting things, moving from being a veterinarian to actually working with agriculture has been, it's been an interesting experience. But it's been very, very fruitful. I've learned a lot, and I'm very happy to be part of it and to see other people grow. I think that's one of the main things here. So I'm a full-time vet, but most of the time I'm working in San Pedro, in Finkela Young, which is part of Sustainable Vets International, and we have a lot of interesting things that we've been trying to accomplish out there.
So Finkela Young, Finca means farm in Spanish. And so if you can can I just show you the island of Ometepe? Because this is the important thing about soil health and how we can combine, how I learned that soil health is what leads to community prosperity and decreased animal suffering and human suffering. So it's over there on the left. And so it's actually 2 volcano islands in the middle of a lake in Nicaragua. But as you can see, these people are landless. It's poverty, landless, and corrupt, lots of problems. But what they're doing is they are trying to feed their families. They are just subsistence farmers, and they are cutting more and more and more up into the jungle, up the volcano there, to just create food. And it's mainly monoculturing. What happens then, we have mudslides, whole towns have been wiped out. Little girl was killed just recently from a mudslide. That's very similar to what happens in Uganda too with our gorilla population. So to save our precious animals and to save our precious lands, we must help with food security, and that comes with soil health. One of the things, but we're also fighting poverty. And so what Farhan and I and we learn to do, so we're novice at this, is finding indigenous organism or showing them how permaculture or regenerative farming can create decreasing inputs, increasing outputs, and you can have a business. One thing I want to say is, what was I going to say? Sorry, I lost it. Everything's usually a cash crop and monoculture. And I'm going to leave it to Farhan. Oh, this is what I was going to say. Most of the, a lot of the people there are illiterate, especially the little boys, because they get pulled from school to work the fields. And so how do you educate and teach those kind of populations? Well, it's the same way you do it in any rural environments. You got to show them. You got to show them that it works, and you got to show them that they can do it within their own hands. And so I was just going to let Farhan say a small little story, a very small story about something that just transformed so many of our work, of our population down there, our town down there.
Thank you, Shelly. So this is interesting with this photo of Ometepe Island. This is the Madeiras part, which is, we have 2 volcanoes. So Madeiras is where we're actually located. One of the interesting things about that, we in the past 2 years, 2 years basically, we've been through a civil uprising. We've been through some hurricanes, and we've also been through the pandemic, right? So Ometepe Island is based on tourism, basically. So all the people are dependent. There's a big population that has been dependent on tourism. And some of them are doing monocrops and stuff like that, basically plantains and watermelons. So when we had the uprising, the economics just, crashed even more. I mean, we are the 3rd poorest country in Latin America. So all this affected, the stability of the people. And funny, right? You can see all the way up on that mountain where they start, cutting down trees and trying to, expand agriculture. But now when there's no tourism at all, this is even worse now, right? This is, expanding even more, right? So we noticed that, that the economics went down, and a lot of people, who used to farm before are starting to want to farm again. And this is causing, a lot of issues with the plantain, crops and stuff like that, especially when hurricane comes and they just fall down. So we try to look for a model that could make, that we talk about, make sure people have their food, right? So start doing, raising chickens, raising pigs, and also using those, teaching them to be, this regenerative system, right? Using the manure from the chickens with the rice husk, using deep bedding for pigs, and also turning all these things into compost so that they can better their soil, right? We had, all these different experiments that we've been doing on Finkela Young on the farm in San Pedro, trying to inoculate mycorrhiza, trying to use indigenous microorganisms to contribute to the soil. We think again, you guys can correct me. I'm just, I'm learning still with this process, but we think with the overuse of, Roundup and other insecticides have actually damaged the biology of the soil in these areas. And this is why as soon as a little wind comes down, you see trees falling down, you see the plantain crops falling, and it's concerning because they put all their money into this, right? All their whatever they borrow money and stuff, and they put it into these crops, and it just goes to waste, right? Because they fall down. So we started experimenting in a more in-house lab, let's call it like that, of creating a mycorrhizal, inoculating. The government, they've been, pushed this a lot also, and they would give out these agro packages that include, education. So we had a consultant come out and teach us how to do mycorrhiza, right? So on our farm, we employed 21 workers. We have half women and half men, and we do these training. And it's interesting to see how this, it's hard for them to palpate, to see, to feel, to believe in. It's kind of, I always use the comparison, like giving a vaccine to an animal, right? You can't see exactly what's going on to them. You don't see them gain weight right away, right? You don't see that. So it's a slow process, teaching them that this is going to take some time and why we're doing it, right, for the future. But this year, we started doing this year, right? And, using cover crops, using green manure, using the compost from the chicken coops, using the composted material from the deep bedding from the pigs. We go all over town to people who have cows, and we clean out their corrals and take that manure, go back and make worm compost. And we actually just made two bigger bins, right? And with these 2 bins now, the demand, because we understand that it's needed so that we can get more and more better the biology of the soil. So, all this, to be honest with you, I was kind of concerned that it wouldn't be inspiring enough to get people to start doing these things, right? But to see how small work, we have like these, in the groups, you have special workers or people who are easily motivated, how they can get the attention of others, and they started doing these things on their own, right? It's been... So one of the results that we've seen that has impressed everybody, because I think that's the only way that they get motivated in doing these things, is seeing the results, right? They think we're crazy, some of them, right? They're like, why are you spending so much time doing, making microorganisms? And they don't get the point how important the biology is for the soil, right? And we just planted coffee beans at the beginning of May, which is our rainy season, and we're finishing the rainy season and going into the dry season now, and these coffee plants are flowering already, right? So this is they're surprised.
Just for the context, it usually takes 2 years for a coffee plant to flower. So for them to see this coffee plant flower in 1 year, that was Shazam enough to say, oh, okay. That was really something they can go home with, similar to what he was saying with the plantains. Our plantains didn't fall down in the hurricane. Everybody else's plantains fell down in the hurricane. They can see that. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
I think, and there's a picture too, I think on the PowerPoint, there's a picture of your 4 crops or your nurse tree, moringa tree, coffee plant, and your compost.
Yeah. So what's different in Nicaragua than North Dakota? North Dakota, a lot of our biomass is a little bit above and mainly below. And in Nicaragua, it's a little bit below and a lot above. And also plots of land, like an acre is a lot. That might be a whole family. So you have to do a lot of food production on very, very, very little land. So how do you make it as fertile as possible? And that is, you make every plant have at least 3 purposes. And so what you see in that middle picture there is, it's kind of small, but you'll see the coffee plant in the center there. That's our crop that we want to do. And then what we do is we plant nurse trees. They're just, they're not going to last that long. So those are your platanos and your bananas, and those are nurse trees. They provide shade and do some things. And then along with moringa trees, which actually, is a good forage for the cattle and horses and stuff. It's a horse culture, so they do most of their work on horses. And then at the bottom there, you see that compost, and that came from our chicken bedding, our pig bedding. We also farm worms, and we can also take some of that manure and we can farm maggots or farm flies that produce maggots, and then we feed the maggots to the chickens. And so and you can just see there's just teeming with life and ideas that has very little input. So that's just an example. So it's very together. Now, being the political place it is, and they have a rainy and a dry season. So when the dry season comes, that's when things get tough. The animals look really horrible. People's plants are, whatever. So water is very, very precious during that time. And so the water committee, so everything's political there, right? Well, everything's political everywhere. But so they were going to charge us per plant. And this is, I have 5 acres left. 35 acres got stolen from me, but we're working on that. But we have 5 acres with a lot of plants, like lots, and they were going to put charges per plant. And so what Ferran and the group came up with is the drip system. And that's what you'll see at the left there, that little bottle, that little Coke bottle. And we put a little 22-inch needle in it, and they put the mycorrhiza and the indigenous microorganisms in there, and that's how we're watering the plants through the dry season. I know I'm kind of going over time here. The photo on the right is actually the veterinary clinic down there on Ometepe Island, and that serves also as a human clinic. We take a lot of X-rays and stuff because the human services aren't there, but I kind of talked fast, but there's a lot to say. But this is what turned me on to soil. Like soil, nobody thinks about. Well, I didn't as a veterinarian, and it's just that soil is life, and soil is prosperity, and it's everything, and it's fun to talk about once you start learning a little bit.
That was interesting that when this project started, about 7 years ago, that. Again, like Shelly mentioned, we were actually focusing only on animals, right? And then we saw, okay, they're not going to take care. Their animals are not their priority. Their priority is to feed, their families, right? So we think that this is a very important part of it. Like if we can get them to harvest or produce more food for themselves and enough food that they can sell, then obviously this is going to translate to a better care for their animals. Put an example. One of the business that we started was, a little broiler farm and laying hens, right? And this is one of our workers, and their dogs. I mean, they really look in bad shape, right? They were very, very underweight, and now they. Their business has thrived, and they learn that they can use like the chicken guts and other stuff, and then they can feed their their dogs and their pigs. They're making all these different cooked food to feed their pigs, so they can get a better production in that area. So everything, I mean, it's a circle, right? Everybody, the animals, the people, and the soil. I think that's like a really tight connection, to be honest.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate you guys, going beyond the borders of North Dakota, especially to Nicaragua, to share with us how soil health is incorporated into your program there. So I think these connections are incredibly interesting, and so I always like learning something new. So thank you very much for providing some information during our Tech Talk. Thanks, Shelly and Ferran, and best of luck down there with your work.
Thanks for joining us along.